ever walked into like a tiny shop, one of those really small businesses, and wondered, like, how do they even choose what to put on the shelves? Well, today we are doing exactly that. We are diving deep into that question. Specifically, we are going to be looking at nanostores in developing countries.
Yeah, these nanostores, they are very easy to miss. Sometimes they're literally in the walls of buildings.
Yeah.
These small, often family-run businesses play a huge role in their communities.
Yeah.
And they operate on incredibly tight budgets.
Yeah.
So understanding their decisions, I think, can give us a really unique perspective on things like economics and supply chains at like a really granular level.
Yeah, I mean, just picturing, a tiny shop, maybe just a single family running it, trying to figure out like, okay, we've only got this much money to buy inventory. What are we going to get,
Absolutely.
Super fascinating. And luckily for us, some researchers got their hands on like a massive data set. We're talking 29 million transactions from a multinational company that supplies these nanostores. So it's like we get to peek behind the curtain of how these businesses actually work.
It really is like having this amazing magnifying glass into this world that we don't usually get to see. And one of the things that they found is that, some of our kind of like basic assumptions about how inventory management works, they don't really hold up when you look at the data.
Okay, so what's the tea? What's the surprising discovery? What did they find?
All right, so think about it this way. Imagine you're running one of these nano stores, right? And your supplier, the company you order your goods from, they suddenly change how often they come to take your order.
Okay, so I'm picturing like a big delivery truck pulling up. Are they coming less often now? Or are they coming more often?
Let's say they go from like weekly visits to every other week.
Okay.
Now, logically, you might assume that the shopkeepers are going to kind of like stock up, order more each time to make up for those less frequent deliveries.
Right, like stock up so you don't run out. That's what I would think. Seems like common sense.
Right, exactly. But that is not what they found. What they found was that when the visits became less frequent, the size of the shopkeepers' orders actually decreased.
Wait, they ordered less?
By an average of 32%.
Wow. Okay, now my brain is like totally breaking. Why would they order less? This is wild.
It's so interesting, right? And that's where this really fascinating intersection of economics and just like basic human behavior comes into play.
Okay.
Because, these shopkeepers, they're working with such small margins. Every decision that they make has really significant consequences.
Right. So like holding a ton of inventory is actually riskier for them than like maybe running out for a little bit.
Absolutely. It's all about managing risk when you've got limited resources. So they would rather kind of order smaller amounts more frequently to avoid the possibility of having all this unsold stuff. And that's the financial hit that comes with it.
Right. Okay. So they're trying to optimize for obviously making a profit, but they're also like hyper aware of potentially losing money.
Exactly.
And I guess with good reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this finding actually kind of challenges these traditional inventory models that, people have been using for a long time, because a lot of these models really focus on profit margin. So the difference between what you pay for a product and what you can sell it for.
Right. I'm following you. So how does that play into this?
So the classic model would predict that with high margin goods, right, so stuff that you make a good profit on, fewer visits from the supplier should lead to larger orders. You're buying in bulk. You're going to kind of meet the demand over a longer period.
Yeah, that makes sense. Especially if you're making a decent profit, then it's like, okay, bulk up, because then you can really cash in. Okay, but what about the items with like the lower profit margins?
So theoretically, with low margin goods, fewer supplier visits should lead to smaller orders, right?
Yeah.
Because it's riskier to tie up, limited cash and a bunch of cheap stuff that might not sell very quickly.
Okay, that makes sense. So there's a logic to it, but it sounds like you're saying that, the shopkeepers, they didn't exactly follow the textbook.
Yeah, not quite. In reality, what they consistently did was order less with fewer visits, regardless of the profit margin.
Interesting.
Which was a head scratcher for the researchers at first. It's like, why aren't they, capitalizing on these kind of high margin opportunities? And that's when they realized, okay, we need to look beyond just the traditional economics of this. We need to look at behavioral economics. What's going on in the minds of these shopkeepers?
We got to get into the psychology of it.
Exactly.
So we got to get into the psychology of it. Okay, I am fascinated. What did the researchers find when they, started looking at the psychology behind these decisions?
Yeah, it turns out even in the world of nanostores, our emotions, they really impact the choices that we make. And, sometimes those choices aren't necessarily the most profitable ones.
Right.
One of the big insights that came out of this was this concept of aversion to leftovers.
Aversion to leftovers. Okay, see, that one I get. There's nothing worse than opening the fridge and like seeing a science experiment staring back at you. But what does that have to do with, a nanostore owner in like rural India?
Yeah, it's not just about, the fear of food spoiling, although that's definitely a factor, especially with perishable goods. But it's more about kind of the psychological cost of having all this unsold inventory. So imagine you are a shopkeeper. Every single unsold item, that represents a potential loss. It's a visual reminder that maybe you're not, maximizing your profits.
Totally. It's like that sinking feeling you get when you realize you overbought at the grocery store.
Yeah.
It's just instead of like a slightly wilted head of lettuce, it's like their livelihood.
Exactly. And remember, these shopkeepers, they often don't have like sophisticated inventory systems. They're relying on their gut, they're relying on their experience, and their gut is telling them, don't get stuck with a surplus, order less frequently, even if it means, maybe making slightly smaller profits in the short term.
It's a safety net, right? Like it's a way to minimize the risk in what's probably a very unpredictable environment. Okay, speaking of risk though, I remember reading something in this research about liquidity preference. What was that all about?
Oh, yeah. That is another fascinating aspect of behavioral economics at play here. Liquidity preference, it basically refers to this tendency that we all have to hold on to cash, especially when things feel uncertain.
Okay. Yeah.
Even if it means missing out on, potential gains in the future.
Okay, I feel personally attacked right now by how relatable that is. Like it's they keep your money under the mattress mentality.
Exactly. And when your resources are limited, having that cash on hand, it just provides this kind of like sense of security. It's a buffer against, unexpected expenses or fluctuations in demand.
Right.
For these shopkeepers, that cash, it represents their ability to like weather a storm.
Yeah.
To keep their business afloat.
It's like the peace of mind that comes with knowing, okay, no matter what happens, at least I can cover, the essentials, even if it means, potentially sacrificing some profit. Okay, but I'm starting to wonder, where do the suppliers fit into all of this? Are they just like sitting back watching this all play out?
Not necessarily. The researchers, they took this a step further, and they actually looked at, the dynamics between suppliers, particularly when you have two suppliers who are both competing for a shopkeeper's very limited budget.
Okay.
And what they found was that even with competition, those behavioral biases, they were still really strong.
So we've got two suppliers, let me guess. One is offering those high margin products, right? The kind that should, like, in theory, have the shopkeeper, rubbing their hands together with glee. And then the other one, maybe not so much.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So you would think, faced with this choice, the shopkeeper is going to go all in on that high margin supplier, right? Yeah. Maximize those profits, especially given how, tight their budgets are.
It seems like a no-brainer, especially given everything we just talked about with, like, their aversion to risk and all of that. So what happened? Did they, like, defy the odds and make the, like, super rational profit maximizing choice?
You would think so, but human behavior, it kind of like threw a wrench of the works. What they discovered was that instead of going all in on that high margin supplier, the shopkeepers, they showed something called over-diversification bias.
Over-diversification bias. Okay, break that down for me.
Yeah.
What does that mean in the context of these nanostores? Over-diversification bias. Okay, that sounds kind of intimidating. Is it as complicated as it sounds?
Not really. It's actually pretty straightforward. It basically means that even though, like, logically, it would be way more profitable to just go all in on that high margin supplier, these shopkeepers, they were spreading their orders around. They were still giving some of their budget to that lower margin supplier.
So they are, like, knowingly leaving money on the table, right?
Yeah.
Choosing the less profitable path, just for the sake of, like, I don't know, variety.
Yeah. And it all comes back to that, like, emotional need for security and predictability that we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
By diversifying, even if it means their profits are a little bit lower, they're creating that safety net for themselves.
Right. So, like, if one supplier, I don't know, has a problem, that there's a delay, or maybe there's a price hike or something, they've got, like, a backup.
Exactly. It's like having a plan B in a world where, let's face it, unexpected challenges, they kind of pop up all the time.
Yeah.
And they might not be sitting there with a calculator, like actually crunching the numbers and figuring out the odds.
Right.
But their intuition is telling them, hey, hedge your bets, spread the risk around.
That is fascinating. But it sounds like this over-diversification bias, it could really create some headaches, right, for the suppliers, the high-margin ones at least, because, like, in theory, they're the ones with the most appealing products.
Absolutely. And it creates this really interesting challenge for those suppliers, because it's like, how do you convince a shopkeeper to consolidate their orders when their gut is telling them to do the exact opposite?
Yeah, it's like it seems like simply offering the best prices or the best quality products, that might not even be enough in this case. So what can these suppliers do? Like, how do they tip the scales in their favor?
Well, this is where the research, I think, offers some really interesting takeaways for any business that's operating in this kind of environment.
Okay.
Because it suggests that maybe the real key is building trust. Showing up consistently, offering reliable service, that could be a game changer.
So instead of just focusing on the transactional side, here are the goods, here's the price, it's more about actually nurturing the relationship. So the shopkeeper feels, I don't know, maybe a little less uncertain, a little more secure.
Exactly. The more reliable a supplier is, the less the shopkeeper feels the need to over-diversify. It's about really establishing a presence, becoming a reliable partner, not just another vendor.
So it's almost like cracking a psychological code. It's not just about logistics and profit margins and all of that. It's about really understanding the human element, right? Like that very, very deep-seated human need to feel secure. That need, it drives so many of our decisions. And apparently it even trickles down to the tiniest shops in the most remote corners of the world.
Absolutely. And, I think what's so powerful about this research is that it really highlights just how universal these behavioral patterns are.
Yeah.
We all grapple with these biases to some extent, whether we are running a nanostore or, trying to figure out our own personal finances.
It's a great reminder that sometimes even the most rational, sensible seeming decisions are actually rooted in our emotions, in our very human need to just feel safe and in control. So the next time you are browsing the aisles of your local store, I don't know, just take a moment to consider all of the forces, both visible and hidden, that shape the world around us, because it really is a fascinating lens through which to view not just economics and globalization and all of that, but also just basic human psychology. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep your curiosity piqued and your minds open to the unexpected.